fuel, things change a bit. It's a liquid as opposed to a solid. And when we look at oil, we see that not only do we have oil, but we get gasoline to drive our cars. Also comes out of oil, and jet fuel in addition. So some of the facts: oil is in units or in terms of barrels, and BTUs again is the energy or work that can be generated from that. The efficiency is a little higher than 31%. I think that's a typo. Profits obviously are extremely lucrative. When looking at self-interest as a motivator, that's important. Lots of externalities, especially CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And reserves are available, but always more difficult to find as we go further into the future. So just a little bit of detail on reserves. There is something called peak oil, which I had thought we had reached in 2005 and 2008 when we had the energy crisis in the world. However, because of the idea of reserves, there's the question of peak oil changes depending on what happens. So in 2011, global production of oil fell from a high point at 2005. But now it's rebounded in 2011 and 2012. And so there's an active debate as to when global peak oil will occur. And really, how do you measure peak oil? And will we ever run out of oil? Or will it just become more and more expensive to use? So this chart gives you a sample of there in 1970 in the US, for example. We hit peak oil in 1970, and this was predicted by Hubert. However, more recently, there's been a resurgence of finding oil in the U.S. through new technological methods, which is a form of reserve. So we've had a bit of a bump in the U.S. and really there's a bump in the world in finding oil in places that had given up on that. Some of the externalities of oil: CO2, CO, sulfur dioxide, NO, VOCs, particulate matter, benzene, formaldehyde, and other chemicals. All of these are byproducts or externalities of burning oil, and so we know that we're going to be paying some sort of societal price, if we haven't already, for the comfort and convenience that oil brings. And certainly the profits are unprecedented. In the billions per quarter, we see profits being gained by really a few companies, really the big 4 or 5 companies that we see out there. But oil has given us amazing comfort in our lives. So for example, oil is such a powerful combustion material or resource that we can actually build gigantic buildings and heat and cool them to the temperature that we desire. So for example, this is an indoor snow skiing resort in the Middle East, and without oil and without the kind of energy that oil brings, we can't get that. Now some would question though whether, and we've covered this a little bit in the class and we'll cover it some more, is how much comfort is enough comfort? And part of sustainability, of course, is really trying to answer that question. Is there something such as extreme comfort, where the burning of oil and other natural resources cannot be justified in order to generate certain kinds of experiences? But this oil allowed the Industrial Revolution to expand at exponential rates, which brought comfort and evolution and societal intelligence across the world. And it certainly raised the quality of life for billions, but certainly not everyone was able to benefit and still doesn't benefit from these kinds of resources. The system for delivering oil to the desktop or to the door or to the car is extremely complex. I'm not going to go through it in detail right now, but you can see the steps from left to right are pretty complex, meaning that the infrastructure level to support the oil industry is very high and very complex. So it's a centralized system. It has high infrastructure. It's an open loop system, as we talked about, and is extremely damaging to ecosystems and affecting us today and into the future. However, the system itself, as long as there are supplies, have an amazing 24/7 capability, which means we can start up and stop down energy or energy production pretty quickly, which makes it a very valuable energy source in terms of how peak demand occurs in the U.S. Some of the externalities that we worry about in terms of reserves: we're going further out to sea and further down to get the same kinds of oil that we used to get very easily 20, 30, 40 years ago. And eventually mistakes and horrible accidents are bound to occur. So the Deepwater Horizon oil spill saw 4.9 million barrels of oil spilled into the Gulf, which had a pretty intense ecosystem impact. 11 people died, so there's a cultural and society impact. There's damage to tourism. There's economic damage that occurs. There's loss of income. However, what's probably pretty amazing, and the only good side to what happened in this event was that BP, British Petroleum, actually stood up and gave reparations to those people who were impacted, as far as I can tell from the research, pretty fairly and pretty quickly. And this is unprecedented when you compare it to, for example, the Exxon Valdez spill that was in 1989. Some of those people are still waiting for compensation. So this is really a commentary on reserves and systems. Now, the culture and societal and cultural impacts of oil have a big impact on worldview. It's an old energy, considering where we are now. The societal benefits are incredible, and the societal costs are very high, especially for future generations. So the question is, are we mortgaging our future, the quality of life of our descendants or future children sorry, it's just a bug here. Very high considering that. So that's the question. That's the ethical question. And we can see how politics play out in oil. For example, in our country in the 1970s, we had the oil embargo, which meant that there was only certain days we could get oil, which is a very humbling experience for this country and changed the way we thought about energy going into the future. And we wonder about the price we pay for oil in terms of war and how valuable this resource really is and how it drives countries and corporations to do things that would be considered ethically unsupportable. And so war becomes one of those externalities, I guess, or results of the energy source. And we are finding more oil around the world. However, in Canada, it takes 2 tons of tar sands to make 1 open barrel of oil. So if you think about the amount of land that it would take, because they're basically squeezing oil out of this, and we'll be covering this in the next to last lecture. So the tar sands oil has a double punch because it devours forests, but also emits lots of carbon dioxide in the process and then the burning of that oil. And that's really not very clean oil, relatively speaking. And the impact to the local tribes and the local ecology are really hard to measure. And so one wonders then about how this oil is transported from these remote areas to ports, and the question of whether pipelines should be built to do that, or whether we should continue to use trains to support the oil, and those trains do run through populated areas. So it's very complex cultural and societal impacts. In this country, we look at the pipeline the Keystone pipeline that's produced. And it's really gotten to be very controversial in this country, not just because it's a pipeline, because of how it enables the oil industry to continue to generate huge profits. And so you'll see in this country and other countries, you'll see protests against these kinds of things. So the tar sands oil is currently transported by train, though. So the problem is that I have right now is I noticed that there was a train crash in Quebec last year where 47 people died moving tar sands oil through Canada into the U.S. to the ports of New Orleans. And so the question about whether to support a pipeline is really, it's a very complex ethical question that has to be wrestled with. So in summation, the experience of oil, the facts, the culture, and society, oil has led to unprecedented improvement in quality of life, but it is a horrible, nasty, pollutive, dangerous source of energy to deal with. From the facts, it's extremely damaging energy substance, it's financially lucrative, and it does work well as a quick start up and start down. From a systems point of view, it's an open loop system with lots of negative externalities, especially CO2 emissions, and extremely damaging to ecosystems. And this is where it gets tricky, because from a cultural and societal perspective, huge benefits to quality of life for many, not all, but also huge societal costs. And I think as sustainable designers, we also find ourselves again in the position of trying to minimize or negate the use of oil in support of the design, construction, and habitation of buildings. And so if we can begin to look at designing buildings that use very small amounts of energy, and we can couple that with other types of renewable energy, which we'll cover in the next lecture, we can begin to wean ourselves off of oil as a primary energy source.